On March 20th, 2009, just before midnight, one critical human error turned a routine takeoff into a life-threatening disaster. An Emirates Airbus A340-541, bound for Dubai, was fully loaded with 257 passengers and 18 crew members. The plane, designed for a long 14-hour flight, began its takeoff on runway 16 of Melbourne Airport. Unknown to pilots, the first officer had mistakenly understated the aircraft's weight by 100 tons. This critical mistake sent all calculations spiraling into chaos. So behind a calm exterior, a disaster was brewing. The aircraft hurtled down the runway at 270 kilometers per hour, the end of the tarmac looming closer with each passing second. The pilots desperately kept on trying to lift off, but it refused to leave the ground. And then the situation grew even more desperate. The tail slammed into the runway, sending a shower of sparks trailing behind. Inside the cabin, passengers sat frozen in horror as metal scraped against asphalt. Soon they were out of runway, out of time, and nearly out of luck. The aircraft thundered past the runway's end by a staggering 148 meters, breaking several structures in its path. With disaster only meters away, the captain made a desperate choice, pushing the engines to full thrust, a final attempt at defying fate. Against all odds, the gambit paid off. This is the unbelievable story of Emirates Flight 407, a flight that nearly ended in flames, but instead became a story of survival against impossible odds. Let's talk about what exactly happened and how the pilots managed to avert the fast-approaching doom. But first, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel to explore more aviation stories where mere meters and seconds have shaped history. Never miss an update about the latest challenges faced in the sky or on the runway. Emirates Flight 407 was a passenger flight en route from Auckland, New Zealand to Dubai, with a stopover at Melbourne, Australia. The aircraft in question was a 5-year-old Airbus A340-541. It was a modern 4-engine aircraft that had an excellent safety record and was amongst the few quad jets that could take on such a long journey without ever stopping to refuel. The weather was also perfect for flying that night. Overall, there was no indication that a disaster would occur. Since the journey ahead was long, there were a total of 4 pilots in the cockpit. 2 were assigned with the takeoff and landing procedures. The other 2, also called the augmenting crew, would be responsible for the cruise portion of the flight. This helped the pilots take rest and turns, ensuring optimal performance throughout the flight. Now, as per Emirates Airlines guidelines, the augmenting crew is required to be present in the cockpit during pre-flight preparations, as well as during the takeoff and landing, for an added margin of safety. So this made the next moments even more perplexing. The passengers were strapped in, the last of their baggage loaded onto the plane, and the pilots began the pre-departure procedures. The captain and the first officer both had more than 8,000 flying hours under their belt. The augmenting captain had the most experience, with more than 12,500 flying hours, and his co-pilot had about half of that. More than 30,000 flying hours combined in the cockpit should have guaranteed that there wouldn't be any room for error or oversight. The cockpit buzzed with activity, crowded with 2 pilots, 2 ground engineers, and the augmenting captain. With limited space, the augmenting co-pilot had to wait outside in the forward galley until the engineers finished and the plane was ready to move. Number 1. While reviewing paperwork and discussing details with the engineers, the distracted first officer entered the flight's weight as 262.9 tons instead of 362.9, 100 tons lighter than the actual weight. Number 2. The electronic flight bag, or EFB, is responsible for calculating the performance parameters the plane needs to be in during the takeoff. It calculated the flap settings, engine thrust, and liftoff speed based on the figures provided by the first officer. As the entered weight was 100 tons low, the EFB underestimated all these factors. Number 3. The first officer handed the calculations to the captain for confirmation before entering the data into the aircraft system. Now, a verbal check, which would have revealed the error, is mandatory, but that also didn't happen. Number 4. The clock struck 10:18 p.m., and the doors of the aircraft closed. By 10:30 p.m., the flight was cleared for takeoff by the ATC and started taxiing down the runway. Number 5. The first officer set the flaps to the first setting rather than the second or third. He also pushed the thrust levels to flex thrust settings, bypassing the toga setting. Nonetheless, the 4 Rolls-Royce engines roared to life. Number 6. The giant plane slowly begins its takeoff down the runway. At first, the rate of acceleration appeared to be slow. However, the flight crew did not express concern. As the A340 has a reputation for being a sluggish aircraft, the massive plane continued its roll, seemingly indifferent to the urgency of the moment. Number 7. The captain called out 100 knots, and the aircraft was in a high-speed regime. Number 8. The aircraft picked up speed and reached V1, which is 143 knots. This is known as the point of no return because the pilots cannot abort the takeoff after that, even in the event of an engine fire or landing gear damage. Number 9. Seconds later, they reached the VR speed, which is 145 knots. The first officer pulled on his side stick to make the nose of the plane airborne, but to his horror, the plane didn't budge at all. Now, this 145 knots VR was for a 100-ton lighter jet, almost 20 knots lower than the required one. Number 10. The first officer pulled and pulled on his side stick, but to no avail. The aircraft, running at 270 kilometers per hour, was now less than 1,000 meters away from the runway threshold. The captain asked his first officer to pull back his side stick one more time. Number 11. The first officer followed through with the commands, and the aircraft's nose lifted slightly. However, it was still very close to the ground. In a moment of desperation, he pulled back on the controls, causing the nose to rise a little higher. But to the crew's shock, the tail struck the runway with great force, sending sparks flying as the aluminum body scraped along the surface. The impact was so severe that the passenger cabin turned red from all the sparks, smelling like smoke and burning metal and insulation, while the runway was littered with debris. The black box of the plane also fell off its rack. Number 12. In a last-ditch effort, the captain took matters into his own hands and set the engines to full thrust, or toga setting. For him and his crew, this was their final chance. Number 13. The plane ran out of runway with its tail scraping in the mud, breaking a strobe light and localizer antenna array in its path. The skin of the aircraft was damaged severely and wasn't pressurized anymore. Number 14. 3 seconds after the toga thrust, the main wheels finally left the ground and the plane started becoming airborne. At this point, the plane was 148 meters beyond the runway. Number 15. As the cabin lost pressure and the landing gear sustained damage, the pilots realized they could not continue their journey to Dubai. They needed to turn back. However, there was a problem. Number 16. Now, in order to turn back and land this plane, they had to dump fuel in order to make the plane lighter. Number 17. Climbing to an altitude of 7,000 feet, they began dumping the fuel in the Port Phillip Bay of Victoria. In order to calculate how much fuel they should dump, the first officer looked at the EFB calculations. It was then that he realized his mistake and the gravity of it. They had to decide a number that was close to the incorrect weight in EFB. Finally, they decided on the final figure of 280 tons. Number 18. The pilots declared pan and were ready to land. After dumping around 80 tons of fuel, the pilots made 3 calculations for landing performance. 2 of them were done using the EFB, and 1 was done using the reference guidebook. Number 19. At 11:25 p.m., the pilots started their descent toward the airport, but soon they heard a rumble and were informed about a possible fire on board because of the presence of smoke. Number 20. The first officer radioed the control tower about the situation and told them that they would be landing earlier than expected. Number 21. Upon touchdown, the captain slammed heavily onto the brakes and put the engines into reverse thrust, trying his best to slow down this massive aircraft. Number 22. Everyone on board was terrified of what may come, but this time the plane came to a stop. Number 23. An hour and 4 minutes after its departure, Flight 407 landed safely on the runway. There were no injuries or casualties reported, but the plane's underside was severely damaged, and the skin panels of the rear fuselage were completely ripped off by the impact. An investigation was also conducted by the ATSB, along with some other aviation safety organizations, and it was found that 2 factors were responsible for the accident: failure to detect the erroneous mistake and delayed detection of the degraded takeoff performance. It was also found that the flight crew didn't complete all of the operating procedures, which led to the inability to detect the input mistake. Emirates reportedly fired the pilots upon their return to Dubai. It also updated its pre-flight procedures and mandated the use of 2 laptops for parameter calculation. They also launched an avionics system for takeoff acceleration monitoring. Airbus also updated its system to detect such errors. The aircraft as well was sent to Toulouse, and after repair, it remained in service for 5 more years for short-haul flights. Flight 407's story teaches us that even the smallest error can bring flights to the brink of disaster. Who do you think was actually in the wrong here? Was the airline to be blamed as well? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more stories about near misses, heroic recoveries, and the lessons that shape modern aviation.